Hey there! The word tariff is absolutely everywhere in the news right now. In 2025, President Trump has announced massive new tariffs, not just on China, which everyone expected, but also on Mexico, Canada, and even close allies like Japan and the EU. Some of these tariffs are hitting 200% or more. But here's what's really wild. Most people have no idea what tariffs actually are, or how they're about to completely change your daily life. You've probably heard the word tariff thrown around like confetti, but do you actually know what it means, how they work, whether they're good or bad, and most importantly, how these new tariffs will affect your wallet, your job, and everything you buy? Well, in this video, we're going to break down everything you need to know about tariffs in simple terms. By the end, you'll understand exactly why tariffs are such a big deal and how they might change everything about how we live and shop. So let's dive in. Section 1. What exactly is a tariff? Simply put, a tariff is a tax that a government puts on products coming from other countries. But why would they do something that sounds so weird? Let me explain with a simple example. Imagine the United States can produce smartphones and sells them for $800 each, but then South Korea can somehow make the exact same quality smartphone for only $400 and export it to America. Obviously, most Americans would prefer the Korean phone because it's half the price and just as good. But this creates a huge problem for American smartphone companies like Apple. They can't compete with that lower price without losing money on every phone. So to protect American businesses and jobs, the US government might put a $500 tariff on Korean smartphones. Now, when that $400 Korean phone comes into America, it gets hit with an extra $500 tax, making it cost $900 total. Suddenly, the American phone at $800 looks like the better deal, and most people will choose to buy American. So in the simplest terms, governments use tariffs to make foreign products more expensive than local ones, hoping people will choose to buy local instead. It's like putting a penalty on imports to give domestic products an artificial advantage. But as we'll see throughout this video, tariffs are way more complicated than they first appear, and they often have consequences that nobody expects. Section 2. The two main types of tariffs. Not all tariffs work the same way. Governments have different methods for applying them, and understanding these differences is crucial for knowing how they'll affect you. The first type is called a specific tariff. This is a fixed dollar amount charged on each item, regardless of how much that item actually costs. For example, the government might say, we're putting a $50 tariff on every imported car tire. So if a tire originally costs $100, adding the $50 tariff makes it $150. If a premium tire costs $300, the same $50 tariff applies, making it $350. The tariff stays the same no matter if you're buying cheap tires or expensive ones. The second type is an ad valorem tariff, which is just a fancy way of saying percentage-based tariff. Instead of a fixed dollar amount, the government charges a percentage of the product's value. For example, the government might impose a 25% tariff on imported cars. If a car originally cost $20,000, the 25% tariff adds $5,000, making the final price $25,000. Now, you've probably heard about these crazy 100% or even 200% tariffs in the news. How does that work? A 100% tariff means you're doubling the price. So, if a product costs $1,000, a 100% tariff adds another $1,000, making it $2,000 total. This is why high tariffs can make imported products completely unaffordable. Most tariffs you hear about in the news are percentage-based because they're more flexible. Cheap goods get proportionally smaller tariffs, expensive goods get bigger ones, rather than hitting everything with the same fixed amount. It's also worth mentioning that besides tariffs, countries use other trade barriers like import quotas, limiting how much can be imported, or strict regulations that make it harder for foreign products to enter. But tariffs are special because they directly add a tax that consumers end up paying. Section 3. The pros and cons of tariffs. After learning what tariffs are, you might be confused about whether they're actually good or bad. The honest answer is, it depends on your perspective and the specific situation. Let's start with the advantages that governments usually claim when they impose tariffs. The first major advantage is protecting domestic industries and jobs. This is the classic argument politicians make, and there's some truth to it. Without tariffs, super cheap imports can flood the market and completely destroy local industries. A perfect example is what happened to Harley-Davidson motorcycles. In the 1970s, Harley had dominated the American heavy motorcycle market, but then Japanese companies like Honda, Yamaha, and Kawasaki started flooding America with cheaper, high-quality bikes. By 1983, Harley's market share had collapsed from nearly 100% to just 15%. The company was on the verge of bankruptcy, and thousands of American jobs were at risk. So Harley asked the government for help, and the US imposed a massive 45% tariff on imported heavy motorcycles. This gave Harley breathing room to restructure, improve their quality, and modernize their factories. The tariffs worked so well that by 1987, Harley had recovered enough to actually ask the government to remove the tariffs early, because they could now compete on their own. The second advantage is increased government revenue. Tariffs are basically an extra tax, and like all taxes, they bring money directly into government coffers. Every time an imported product gets hit with a tariff, that money goes straight to the treasury. The government can then theoretically use this money for infrastructure, education, healthcare, or other public services. In practice, though, tariff revenue usually represents a tiny fraction of total government income in modern economies. The third advantage is using tariffs as a negotiation tool or weapon. Countries often threaten tariffs to pressure other nations into changing their behavior. For example, the US has threatened Mexico with tariffs to push for stricter border control and immigration enforcement. Tariffs can also be used to force companies to move production back home. When the US put tariffs on China, the hope was that American companies would move their factories back to America, creating jobs and reducing dependence on foreign manufacturing. However, this strategy often backfires. Instead of moving back to America, most companies just moved their production to other low-cost countries like Vietnam, Thailand, or Bangladesh that weren't affected by the tariffs. Now let's talk about the disadvantages, which are often much more significant than the benefits. The first and biggest disadvantage is higher costs for consumers. This is what most economists worry about, and it's what directly affects your wallet. Here's how it works. Let's say a Mexican company makes shoes that cost $50 to produce, and they sell them to American stores for $70, making a $20 profit. Now, the US government imposes a $30 tariff on Mexican shoes. The Mexican company has to pay that $30 tariff to get their shoes into the American market. Since they're only making $20 profit per pair, they can't absorb the full tariff cost, so they raise their price to $100 to maintain their profit margin. Who ends up paying that extra $30? You do, the American consumer buying those shoes. The tariff gets passed directly to shoppers in the form of higher prices. The second major disadvantage is that tariffs hurt domestic businesses that rely on imports. For example, imagine an American furniture company that imports wood from Canada because it's cheaper and higher quality. If the US puts tariffs on Canadian wood, that furniture company's costs skyrocket. They have three bad choices: absorb the higher costs and lose money, raise their furniture prices and lose customers, or switch to lower quality domestic wood and hurt their reputation. None of these options help the American economy. The third disadvantage is damaged international relationships and trade wars. When one country imposes tariffs, the targeted country usually sees it as an attack and retaliates with their own tariffs. This creates a spiral where both countries keep raising tariffs and expanding them to more products. Section 4. Do tariffs actually work? The short answer is sometimes they work, but most of the time they create more problems than they solve. Let me illustrate this with a story. Imagine two neighboring countries, Techland and Farmland. Techland was famous for making the world's best smartphones and computers, while Farmland grew the most delicious fruits and vegetables on the planet. People in Techland loved Farmland's organic produce, and people in Farmland couldn't get enough of Techland's gadgets. They traded happily for years, and both countries prospered. One day, the Techland government noticed that people were importing massive amounts of food from Farmland. Local farmers in Techland started complaining that they couldn't compete because Farmland's produce was cheaper, fresher, and better quality. Politicians in Techland decided to protect their farmers by placing a 50% tariff on all imported food from Farmland. This made Farmland's produce much more expensive, and the government hoped people would buy local food instead. At first, it seemed to work. More consumers in Techland started buying local produce because it was now cheaper than the imported stuff. Techland's farmers were happy and thanked the politicians for saving their industry. But then the problem started. Loyal customers who preferred Farmland's higher quality produce were forced to pay much more or settle for inferior local products. Restaurants in Techland that built their reputation on using premium farmland ingredients saw their costs skyrocket. Some of Techland's farmers, now protected from competition, got lazy. They realized they could sell their products even if the quality wasn't great because customers had fewer options. Innovation slowed down and quality actually decreased. Meanwhile, Farmland was furious. Their exporters were losing huge amounts of business, and their economy was suffering. So Farmland's government decided to retaliate by imposing a 60% tariff on all imported imported electronics from Techland. Now Techland's tech companies started suffering too. Their smartphones and computers became too expensive in farmland, so they lost a major market. Tech workers in Techland started losing their jobs, but it got worse. Farmland's tech companies, which used to import advanced components from Techland for their own products, now faced much higher costs. This made their products more expensive and less competitive globally. Both countries kept escalating, adding more tariffs on more products. The only winners were third countries like Midland, which suddenly found new opportunities to export their own tech products and food to both Techland and farmland at competitive prices. This story illustrates why most economists are skeptical of tariffs. They might provide short-term protection for specific industries, but they often create a cascade of unintended consequences that hurt the overall economy. Section 5. Real-world examples of tariffs. Now you might be thinking, if tariffs usually backfire, why do governments keep using them? The answer is that occasionally, under very specific circumstances, tariffs can actually work, but the failures are much more common and dramatic. Let's start with a success story. South Korea's automobile industry in the 1960s and 1970s. At that time, Korean car companies like Hyundai and Kia were tiny startups trying to compete against established giants like Ford, Toyota, and Volkswagen. South Korea imposed very high tariffs on imported cars, sometimes over 100%, to give their domestic companies a chance to grow. But here's the key difference. Instead of getting lazy behind these protective walls, Korean companies used the time and space to innovate aggressively. Hyundai and Kia invested heavily in technology, quality control, and manufacturing efficiency. They knew the tariffs wouldn't last forever, so they had to become genuinely competitive. South Korea also avoided retaliation because their car market was still small, and other countries didn't see them as a major threat yet. Additionally, South Korea combined tariffs with smart industrial policy, massive investments in education and technology, and strategic partnerships with foreign companies that brought in expertise. The result? By the 1990s and 2000s, Hyundai and Kia had become globally competitive brands that could succeed without any protection. Today, they're major players in the international car market, competing successfully against companies from America, Japan, and Germany. Now let's look at a spectacular failure, the US-China trade war that began in 2018 during Trump's first presidency. This is a perfect example of how tariffs can spiral out of control and hurt everyone involved. Trump saw that America was importing far more from China than it was exporting, creating a massive trade deficit. He believed that imposing tariffs on Chinese goods would force China to buy more American products and bring manufacturing jobs back to America. Starting in 2018, the US imposed tariffs on hundreds of billions of dollars worth of Chinese imports, everything from electronics to clothing to machinery. Some tariffs reached 25% or higher. China immediately retaliated with their own tariffs on American exports, particularly targeting agricultural products like soybeans, corn, and pork. This was strategically designed to hurt Trump politically by targeting farmers in key swing states. So, what actually happened? Chinese companies did lose market share in America because their products became more expensive. But American consumers ended up paying higher prices for everything from smartphones to furniture. American farmers got devastated. According to studies by Moody's Analytics, the trade war cost the American economy about 300,000 jobs and reduced GDP growth by 0.3%. Consumer prices rose across the board as companies passed tariff costs to shoppers. But here's the really interesting part. The biggest winner wasn't America or China, it was Vietnam. As companies rushed to avoid Chinese tariffs, many moved their production to Vietnam, Thailand, Bangladesh, and other countries. Vietnam's exports to America exploded as manufacturers relocated their factories there. So instead of bringing jobs back to America, the tariffs just shifted Chinese jobs to other Asian countries. The US trade deficit didn't improve much because Americans kept buying the same products, just from different countries. Meanwhile, American companies that depended on Chinese components or materials faced huge cost increases. Tech companies, furniture makers, toy manufacturers, everyone suffered from higher input costs. Even today, many of those tariffs remain in place, and American consumers are still paying higher prices. The trade war proved that in a globalized economy, tariffs often hurt the country imposing them, just as much as the target country. Section 6. How tariffs will affect your daily life. Now let's get practical. With all the new tariffs being announced in 2025, how will this actually impact you personally? First, expect higher prices on almost everything. If you shop at Walmart, Target, or any major retailer, you'll notice price increases on imported goods. Electronics, clothing, furniture, toys, tools, anything made overseas will cost more. Your morning coffee might get more expensive if the beans are imported. Your smartphone upgrade will cost more. Even your car might be pricier if it contains imported parts or materials. Second, your job could be affected in unexpected ways. If you work for a company that uses imported materials, your employer might struggle with higher costs. Some companies might cut jobs to maintain profits. On the flip side, if you work in an industry that competes with imports, you might benefit from increased demand for domestic products. Manufacturing workers in protected industries could see job opportunities increase. Third, your investment portfolio will likely be affected. Companies that rely heavily on imports will see their profit margins squeezed. Meanwhile, domestic producers in protected industries might see their stock prices rise. Fourth, if you're planning any major purchases, a new car, home appliances, furniture, you might want to buy sooner rather than later, before tariff-induced price increases take full effect. The overall impact depends on your personal situation, but historically, tariffs tend to act like a regressive tax that hurts lower-income households more than wealthy ones, since the poor spend a higher percentage of their income on goods affected by tariffs. Tariffs are a powerful but blunt economic tool that can sometimes protect domestic industries and create jobs, but more often lead to higher consumer prices, trade wars, and unintended economic consequences. Whether tariffs help or hurt depends on how they're designed, which industries they target, how other countries respond, and what other economic policies accompany them. The key is understanding that tariffs are never just about trade. They're about politics, jobs, national security, and economic philosophy. As we move into 2025 with new tariff policies taking effect, it's crucial to understand how these decisions will ripple through the economy and affect your daily life. Knowledge is power, especially when it comes to your money and your future. What do you think about tariffs? Are they a necessary tool to protect domestic jobs, or do they do more harm than good? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. I read every single one and love hearing different perspectives. If this video helped you understand tariffs better, please give it a like and subscribe to Knowledge for Dummies 101 for more videos that break down complex topics into simple, understandable explanations. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.